Hello learners, welcome to House of Data Science. Today we'll study hypothesis testing. Last time we covered inferential statistics and we know hypothesis testing is one of the major part of inferential statistics, right? So without further ado, let's move to today's agenda. What are hypotheses? So basically hypothesis का मतलब क्या होता है? Hypothesis का मतलब होता है कि अगर हम किसी चीज पे कोई एक हाइपोथेसिस करते हैं कि इस पर्टिकुलर क्लास का जो एवरेज मार्क्स है वो 70 है, तो क्या वो 70 होगा या नहीं होगा, तो वो एक हमारा अजम्पशन है. दैट इज व्हाट इज हाइपोथेसिस. देन विल लर्न द बेसिक्स ऑफ हाइपोथेसिस, व्हाट इज अल्फा, पी वैल्यू, what is the process of hypothesis testing, what kind of error can be made in hypothesis testing, and then practical application, because the beauty of data science is that you learn every theory concept, you use it practically, and then the tips and conclusions for the same. So what is hypothesis testing? When we perform an analysis on a population sample, the analysis could be descriptive, inferential और exploratory in nature. So descriptive क्या होता है? Descriptive जब हम किसी चीज़ को describe करते हैं. इन्फ्रेंशियल हमने देखा कि अगर हम एक सैंपल पॉपुलेशन के लिए करते हैं, या फिर एक्सप्लोरेटरी जो कि हम पूरे डेटा को एक्सप्लोर करके उसके बारे में जान सकते हैं. Then we get a certain information from which we can make claims about the entire population. हम एक पूरे पॉपुलेशन के बारे में क्लेम कर सकते हैं, जैसे कि हमने लास्ट टाइम डिस्कस किया कि वी हैव अ सैंपल ऑफ फ्रॉम इलेक्शन रिजल्ट्स. So there are the pre-polls which are done, right? So because of that you get to understand what kind of party the people are likely to choose in the upcoming election. So that sample is done maybe only on 1000 or 5000 people, but the actual election when it is conducted, it is on lakhs of people, maybe 5 lakh from one constituency. So that is the beauty of sampling and using the inferential and hypothesis testing. So hypothesis is again just a claim which we can't be sure if it is actually true, right? So as I said, if we are making a claim that average marks of a class is 80 and then we are not sure whether it is true or not, so that is the hypothesis which we are making. So there is a way to check if hypothesis has truth to it, and if hypothesis is true, then apply it to the population parameter. So if it turns out to be true on the sample, then we can say the same hold good for the population as well. This is called hypothesis testing. The goal is to identify whether there is enough evidence to infer the hypothesis about the population parameter is true. So basically we want to prove whether if we are making a hypothesis, whether it is true or not. So there are two parts to it. Either we reject the hypothesis, that suppose we said a hypothesis is that maximum people are coming to office before 10 a.m. So what would be the rejection of that? That maximum people are after coming after 10 a.m., right? So there is one thing to hypothesis testing. Either we reject our hypothesis or we fail to reject our hypothesis. Yes. So that is just another way of saying accepting a hypothesis. So we never accept a hypothesis. We always say we fail to reject the hypothesis. So that is the hypothesis testing. So what is null hypothesis? Null hypothesis represents the default or status quo. It states that there is no significant effect, no difference, or no relationship between the variable. It aims to test against the hypothesis. And null hypothesis is denoted by H naught. So this is a symbol which is given to H naught. So again, null hypothesis क्या है कि हम वहाँ पे एक significant effect नहीं है और हमको कोई डिफरेंस नहीं मिला, सो वो नल हाइपोथेसिस होता है. ऑल्टरनेट हाइपोथेसिस क्या होता है? ऑल्टरनेट हाइपोथेसिस रिप्रेजेंट अ क्लेम और एफर्ट दैट we want to test. It suggests that there is a significant effect difference between two variables, contrary to the null hypothesis. So in null hypothesis we were saying there is no difference, no relationship, but here we are saying there is a relationship, there is some difference between the two variables which we are comparing. Alternate hypothesis is denoted as H1. So this is a symbol for alternate hypothesis. Now let's have an example. Suppose a man has been charged with murder. In the case of criminal trial, the jury decide whether the defendant is innocent or guilty. Now it can have two hypotheses. You can claim that defendant is is innocent, you can claim that defendant is not innocent, that is guilty. Null hypothesis. In criminal trial, the defendant was considered innocent. So the null hypothesis claim that he is innocent, just like he was before the charge of a murder. Null hypothesis is denoted by H naught. So we were saying that criminal is innocent, and null hypothesis says the same. Alternate says your claim or if you are the prosecutor in trial, your claim would be that defendant is guilty. So if I am supporting the defendant to be innocent, it will be null hypothesis, whereas alternate would be that he is guilty, and you would try to prove this. So the alternate hypothesis assumptions that competes with the null hypothesis, that is, it is against the null hypothesis. So this is the difference between a null hypothesis and a alternate hypothesis. So outcome of a hypothesis. Suppose at the end of the trial, the jury reaches a decision. What would be the outcome in terms of hypothesis testing? If the defendant is found guilty, it means that the jury rejects the null hypothesis in the favor of alternate. Remember, the alternate hypothesis was that he is guilty, whereas null hypothesis was he is innocent. So if he is found guilty at the end, so it will reject the null hypothesis and it will favor the alternate hypothesis. There is enough evidence to support the alternate hypothesis and conclude that defendant is guilty. On other hand, if jury acquits the defendant, that means he is innocent. There is not enough evidence to support the alternate hypothesis. That is, there is not even evidence to support that he is guilty. Keeping in mind, it does not mean defendant is innocent. We just say there is not enough evidence to conclude he is guilty. In other words, we cannot accept the null. We cannot say we accept the null hypothesis. We can only fail to reject it. So basically, we fail to reject the null hypothesis. That is, we fail to reject that he was not guilty, right? So if we fail to reject, that means we accept that he was not guilty, but we cannot say it because we always say in terms of alternate hypothesis. So there are two things which can happen: either we reject the null hypothesis or we fail to reject it. If it is in the favor of null hypothesis, if it is in the favor of alternate hypothesis, then we reject the null hypothesis. Therefore, in hypothesis testing, if there is sufficient evidence to support the alternate hypothesis, you reject the null hypothesis, right? Simple. And if there is not sufficient evidence to support the alternate hypothesis, you fail to reject the null hypothesis. That is nothing but you are accepting the null hypothesis. So you should never say that you accept the null hypothesis, but it actually means that, because actually you are rejecting the alternate hypothesis. So you say that you fail to reject the null hypothesis, which is opposite of the alternate hypothesis, right? So I hope this is clear to you all. Null hypothesis and alternate hypothesis, it is very important to understand the meaning of these two. Now next, what is next? Next is p-value. It is a parameter or a mathematical value which is very important to say whether your null hypothesis was correct or not. So p-value measures the strength of evidence that supports a null hypothesis. Suppose a test statistics in a hypothesis is equal to k. The p-value is the probability of observing a test statistic and extreme as k. Assuming the null hypothesis is true, we reject the null hypothesis if the p-value is less than the significance level. So if p-value is more than the significance level, then we fail to reject the null hypothesis. But if it is less than a significance level, we reject the null hypothesis. So steps you have to follow to make a decision using a p-value. Calculate the z-score for a sample mean point of distribution for p-value method. Calculate the p-value from cumulative probability for a given z-score using the z-table. So there is a process of using z-score from a z-table, and finally make a decision on the p-value. Multiply it by 2 for a two-tailed test. If you are doing a two-tailed test, you have to multiply it by 2. So there is two things. One is a two-tailed test and one is a one-tailed test. So if I'm saying my average lead content in a food product is 350. So it can be more than 350, it can be less than 350 also. So it is a two-tailed test. If we are saying the lead content is minimum 350. So we are saying it can be more than 350, but it cannot be less than 350. So then it becomes a one-tailed test. That is a difference between a two-tailed test and a one-tailed test. So this is an important parameter to derive a p-value. So how to see it? So suppose now you are getting a z-score of 3.02. This is a z-table, and from here you can actually read the p-value. So the p-value at this particular point is minus 0.13, which is for minus 3.02. So for plus 3.02, it would be 1 minus this, which is 0.9887. For one tail test, it becomes 0.003. For two tail test, it is 0.026. So generally the acceptance value for a p-value is 0.05. So because it is less than this, we will reject the null hypothesis for this particular scenario. So that is how we use the z table to calculate the p-value.